Stanford University.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program, Fuzzy and Techie, A False Divide. I'm Louis Newman, the Director of Undergraduate Advising and Research here at Stanford, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Office of the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, who is the primary sponsor of this evening's event. I want to begin by acknowledging and expressing our gratitude to the co-sponsors of this evening, School of Humanities and Sciences, the School of Engineering, BEAM, Stanford's Career Education Center, and the Stanford Alumni Association. This evening's program is being videotaped, and a link to that tape will be put on the website for this event. I encourage you to share it with your friends, parents, and colleagues who may not be able to be here to join us in person this evening. Finally, I want to give a special shout out to Niles Wilson, Program Coordinator in UAR, who's managed all the logistics for our program this evening. We live in an increasingly techie world, one in which our lives are more and more profoundly shaped by innovations that touch and transform us, indeed every aspect of our society. In a world and in an academic institution like Stanford, where technological expertise and ingenuity is so highly prized, it's no wonder that fuzzy skills often seem somewhat sidelined. It's not only the perennial, what are you going to do with that major, career question in response to a student deciding to major in a humanities or social science field. The question is actually deeper. What value does humanistic inquiry have in a world increasingly oriented towards science and technology? Where do fuzzies fit in a techie world? And even more fundamentally, what is my Stanford education for? What knowledge, skills, and values will I need for the rest of my life? And how will my education help me to acquire them? It's the goal of tonight's conversation to explore these and related questions. And I can't think of a better group of people to help us do that than the experts we have here with us tonight, all of them Stanford alumni. I want now to introduce them to you and then invite them to take the stage for tonight's program. Scott Hartley is a venture capitalist and author of The Fuzzy and the Techie: Why the Liberal Arts Will Rule the Digital World, which was the inspiration for tonight's program. His book has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. It was named a Financial Times Business Book of the Month, a finalist for the FT McKinsey Bracken Power Prize for an author under the age of 35, and has since been translated into half a dozen languages. It comes out with Penguin India in May and in paperback with Mariner Books in June. He has been a Presidential Innovation Fellow at the White House under President Obama, a partner at Moore Davidow Ventures on Sand Hill Road, and prior to VC, he worked at Google, Facebook, and Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. He received his BA in Political Science from Stanford, and then an MA and MBA from Columbia. And I should add that at the conclusion of tonight's program, Scott will be signing copies of his book at a table out in front of CEMEX Auditorium by the color wall. Tracey Chow is an entrepreneur, software engineer, and diversity advocate. She's currently exploring and advising a range of new projects across the startup world, civic tech and engagement, and diversity activism. From 2011 to 2016, Tracey was an engineer and tech lead at Pinterest. Before Pinterest, she worked at Quora, also as an early engineer. During the previous federal administration, she was on reserve with the U.S. Digital Service as a technical consultant. Alongside her engineering career, Tracey is best known for her work promoting diversity in tech. In 2013, she helped to kick off the wave of tech company diversity data disclosures with a GitHub repository collecting numbers on women in engineering. Tracey is now a founding member of Project Include. For her advocacy and activism work, she has appeared on the covers of The Atlantic, Wired, and MIT Technology Review, been named Forbes Tech 30 Under 30, MIT Technology Review 35 Innovators Under 35, and Fast Company Most Creative People in Business. She has also been profiled in Vogue and Elle, among other media outlets. Tracey is an advisor to Homebrew VC and enjoys working with startups on engineering, product, culture, and diversity. Tracey graduated from Stanford with a BS in electrical engineering and an MS in computer science. She was a Terman Scholar and Mayfield Fellow and elected to Phi Beta Kappa and Tau Beta Pi. Marissa Meyer was president and CEO of Yahoo from 2012 to 2017, leading the company's push to reinvent itself for the mobile era. Under her leadership and with a renewed focus on its users, Yahoo grew to serve over 1 billion people worldwide, with over 600 million users on mobile. Marissa also transformed the company's approach to advertising, inventing new formats for mobile, video, native, and social, and ultimately grew the company's new areas of investment into a billion-dollar business. In June 2017, Marissa oversaw the successful sale of Yahoo's operating business to Verizon. Prior to Yahoo, Marissa was vice president of local maps and location services at Google. During her 13 years at Google, Marissa held numerous positions, including engineer, designer, product manager, and executive, and launched more than 100 well-known features and products. She played an important role in Google Search, leading the product management effort for more than 10 years. Previously, Marissa worked at the UBS Research Lab in Zurich and at SRI International here in Menlo Park. She graduated with honors from Stanford University with a BS in Symbolic Systems and an MS in Computer Science. Our moderator tonight is Mehran Ahmed, teaching professor and associate chair for education in the Computer Science Department. He is also the Robert and Ruth Halperin University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. Prior to joining the Stanford faculty in 2007, he was a senior research scientist at Google for several years. His research interests include computer science education, machine learning, and web search. He has over 20 patent filings on a variety of topics, including machine learning, web search, recommendation engines and social networks, and email spam filtering that have been deployed in commercial applications. He co-chaired the ACM IEEE CS Joint Task Force on Computer Science Curricula in 2013, which was responsible for creating curricular guidelines for college programs in computer science at an international level. And for that work, he received the 2014 ACM Presidential Award. He received the 2017 CIKM Test of Time Award, recognizing outstanding research papers that had an important and sustained impact on the research community. He received his BS, MS, and PhD degrees in computer science here at Stanford. The format of tonight's program is that our panelists will engage in conversation with one another for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open this up for questions from the audience. Please join me now in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists.
So thank you for those generous introductions, Louis, and thank you to all the panelists for being here tonight. What we're going to do, as Louis mentioned, is we'll have some questions, a few topics that we're going to discuss beforehand, then we'll open it up to questions as well. But we'll just jump right into things to get started. And one of the discussion points for tonight is talking about this notion of fuzzy and techie. So we figured we'd start off by looking at how people define the notion of fuzzy and techie and what connotations they carry and why sometimes they're viewed as opposites. So why don't we start with that question, see what your thoughts are.
Well, thanks everybody for being here on this beautiful day and joining us in this fun conversation. So the fuzzy and techie terms, obviously, all of us at Stanford know, kind of refer to this duality on campus between people who study the humanities or social sciences and those that study the engineering or technical sciences, the hard sciences. And really, I think for me, this notion is sort of a false duality because, as any of us know, between looking at some of the anthropological research or user experience type of research that goes into launching any engineering product, it can be very fuzzy in some ways and very design centric. And then similarly on the technical, on the fuzzy side, if you're taking a computer science, a political science class, or you're taking something in international relations, these can often involve sort of statistical software. They can involve thinking about game theory or thinking about some of the hard elements. And so in many ways, it's sort of a false dichotomy because you can be a highly creative systems engineer, you can be a highly technical political scientist. And so I think that's sort of one notion that I'd like to unpack.
Did anybody use the term fucky when you were here?
Yeah, I did hear that. I mentioned to Lewis, and he said that's not kosher for the panel.
Well,
It is now.
I was just waiting for somebody else to say it.
All right.
Any other thoughts on that? Or should we? All right, that pretty much just, with that, we will segue to our next question. So one of the impetuses for the panel is this book that Scott wrote, The Fuzzy and the Techie, Why Liberal Arts Will Rule the Digital World. And so in that book, Scott, you talk a little bit about the article, or the address actually, of the two cultures that C.P. Snow gave in 1959 about the evolution of science and humanities and a divide between them. And you sort of see the fuzzy techie gap as an evolution of that. Can you talk a little bit more about that history?
Yeah, so for anyone who's not familiar, the lecture that Mehran refers to, C.P. Snow, Scott Charles Percy Snow, he was both a physicist and a novelist, and he delivered a lecture at Cambridge University in 1959 where he lamented what he saw to be this growing chasm between the two sides. And sort of going all the way back to the Greeks in antiquity, sort of the idea of liberal arts or artis liberalis was to kind of tug on the mind in different ways, to free the mind by exposing you to a plurality of different viewpoints, different insights. And through the bureaucracies and ways of running large institutions, things kind of got divvied up into being sciences on one side of campus, humanities on the other side of campus, people sort of self-identifying in one camp or the other, a little bit of lighthearted jousting or competition between the two sides. And really, going back to 1959, he said, great thinking and innovation really happens at the intersection points. We need people that read Shakespeare and know the laws of thermodynamics, or people that study biology and read James Joyce. And so for me, the impetus for writing the book was really looking at the world 60 years in the future today and saying, well, we have all these conversations about the importance of science, technology, engineering, and math, the importance of learning to code, the importance of big data and sort of all these topics, artificial intelligence. Yet on the flip side, we sort of talk about the counterpoint being the ethics, or the counterpoint being the context vis-a-vis the code. And really, it's not about one versus the other. It's like, how do we bring these two things together? And I think that's sort of the purpose of this panel, and what a lot of our work, I think, these days is focused on, is thinking about not just artificial intelligence and ethics in two different buckets like fuzzies and techies, but how do we really merge these two sides?
Right. And along those lines, so I want to point out another reading piece that I would also highly recommend to you. So this is an article by Tracey on a reformed techie me considers the value of a fuzzy education. And I would recommend you all read this. It's not a long read according to was it Medium? It's a 6-minute read, but it is 6 minutes very well spent, I have to say. So I'm going to ask Tracey a question about that, but first I would just want to give you a little context from the article. So in the Medium post, you wrote, I studied engineering at Stanford University, and at the time I thought that was all I needed to study. I dutifully completed my general education requirements in ethical reasoning and global community, but I was dismissive of the idea that there was any real value to be gleaned from the coursework. Ruefully, and with some embarrassment at my younger self's condescending attitude toward the humanities, I now wish I had strived for a proper liberal arts education. It worries me that so many of the builders of technology today are people like me, people who haven't spent anywhere near enough time thinking about these larger questions of what it is that we are building and what are the implications for the world. So I think that's beautifully said. And I would ask you, when did you become a reformed techie, and what does that mean to you?
There were numerous points of realization, I think, that brought me to this. One was actually just working in a startup. At the time, I was working at Quora, which is a question and answer site, and we were making decisions as engineers about what we were building and what we thought would be good for users, and making a lot of value judgments, and also trying to hypothesize what people's character was like, if we should assume that people are naturally good or bad, and if we let people do whatever they wanted on the site, would that lead to a good outcome or a bad outcome? And so questions in the product like, should we allow people to edit anything and then be able to revert those changes if they're bad? Or should we make people ask for permission so they would attempt to change things and those changes would have to be approved? So these different philosophies around what is human nature like and how do communities evolve, and how can we guide communities to go in the direction that we want, and what are we editorializing, and realizing how much we as engineers who write code were imposing our view of the world on our product and our users made me realize how little I was equipped to actually do that well. And there were a number of other instances in product building where this sort of thing came up. One that's very relevant more recently is around this idea of free speech and allowing people to say things that can be very hurtful or mean. And it's like on Twitter, they've gone in the direction of allowing people to speak pretty freely, and in this name of free speech, have actually cut out a lot of speech from people who aren't safe, don't feel safe on these platforms. One of the first features I built on Quora was the block button, because I was getting harassed and called names, and I just felt it very personally. But I hadn't really thought about these implications of, like, if we design communities in particular ways, like what kind of behaviors then result. So it was in that process of building a lot of products that I started to think about what I was missing in my ability to build. Later on, started doing more work around diversity and inclusion, and this is another example of something that I really had no idea about when I was in school. Even though I knew that there weren't very many women in engineering in my classes, I hadn't thought about the structural reasons why that might be, and where there might be bias and discrimination, and these systems of marginalization, like all these things that I now am much more familiar with. I had no idea that these existed back then. And I really bought into the idea of meritocracy, for example, and this is something that was very easy to buy into at Stanford, which is a very prestigious university, and the credential is a great one. Everybody tells you, like, a Stanford degree is like what you need to go into Silicon Valley and make it. And I wanted to believe that these markers I had and these credentials were the ones that made me the most worthy. And it wasn't until later, when I was doing all this work around diversity and inclusion, some of it motivated by personal experience, but some of it just looking at the industry and thinking about what was better, what was more right. Did I see, like, how there's been so much research and, like, study of all of these systems of society, and now I was seeing how they intersected with the technology and products that we were building.
So given that experience, is there, you were talking about your younger self, there's a lot of your younger selves here now. Is there something that you would want to tell them that you wish someone had told you at that time?
I think it's good to just be curious about the world and try to learn about the systems that surround us. I don't think it's just about taking classes. Like, I was forced to take some number of humanities classes, but I didn't appreciate them. So I don't think the solution is just take a bunch more humanities classes. I think there has to be a deep appreciation and a curiosity about understanding the world that underlies, like, a true education in the humanities and liberal arts.
Nice. So if we think about putting those things together and turning it into a career, to turn this over to Marissa, you've been a VP at Google, CEO of Yahoo. Hiring, I would imagine, is probably one of your most important decisions. And what are the things? And you're also hiring people who are not just, say, working in the trenches, but also leaders. What are the kinds of skills you look for when you do that?
Well, certainly, I think one of the things is that you look for people who can see the connections between things, and have they've seen something once, even in a very different setting, they can see, an analogy in something else. And so you look for people that can see the connections. And I think people who are well-rounded across fuzzy and techie often exhibit that better. And to the point of building systems, you really want someone who can also empathize right? That you could have an idea, okay, like when this gets in front of someone, how are they going to react to it? Where will they look? What will they do? So you're designing something that ultimately really fits that need. But there's this also, I'll just sort of relay an experience I had here that goes back to sort of broad general requirements. One of my favorite classes that I took while I was at Stanford, which is really random, my background is my mom was an art teacher, my father was an engineer, so I've always grown up with a little bit of balance of fuzzy and techie. I did symbolic systems. But I was thinking the other day about the broad requirements, and one of the, I think to fill at the time, requirement number 6, I took the American musical, which I've always loved Broadway musicals, but it had like no bearing on anything I did in tech, nothing even on the soft side of symbolic systems. But it's funny because I actually think about that class, American musical, all the time. And one of the things that we did is we actually looked at a musical from each decade throughout the 1900s. And you can sort of see how it moves from being like the South Pacific to being like Rent and now ultimately Hamilton, which obviously wasn't something we studied at the time. But one of the things that I see an analogy from is something where you can see user and audience expectations are always rising. It's really interesting to sort of, for example, look at like a musical from the 1950s, the things they would have to spell out in song, in sets, in costume changes. She's worried she'll never see him again. Today's theater goers would just see that in a sideways glance and a pensive look. But they have, whole scenes in South Pacific that try and express that emotion. Similarly, one of the reasons I think of that is a lot of times when you're designing and you're trying to pull together that technical element, that empathetic element, you also have to keep in mind the fact that the audience expectation, how sophisticated something can be, how much they'll still get it, is always rising too. And so it's interesting, I think that one of the strongest things that comes from a well-balanced education is the ability to connect. And I will say, I'm somewhat in Scott's camp that there's a false divide, but I think if anything more, what we're seeing is a convergence. I actually think that the two disciplines, or the two sides of the disciplines, used to be further apart, and now they're coming close together. The classic example of this at Yahoo was when I got there, everyone liked to debate. It was like the employees and maybe Silicon Valley's favorite parlor game is Yahoo a tech company or a media company? Or a media-influenced tech company, or a tech-influenced media company, right? And I was like, we had to sort of say, wait, like, in some ways this is just sort of an interesting version of navel-gazing of like, what does it matter? We need to be a company that builds things that people really want and use every day, and let's focus on that. But one of the things I also pointed out to people is it's very hard to even look at classically technical companies like Google and Facebook and even Amazon and say that they now, with all their media arms, that they don't have a really heavy media component. If you say sort of media is more like fuzzy, there's a lot more creative work happening in it, and then there's obviously the tech work. And now a lot of the classic media companies have a very, very strong technical edge and bend. And so I think there's actually a convergence happening, and people who pay attention to both sides are well positioned for that.
Nice. So I guess one of the things you referred to was being a symbolic systems major, which is kind of a curricular way to think about that convergence. See, Tom Wasow is here, who helped create that program, or the creation of that program. Scott refers to it in his book as one of the special, unique programs at Stanford. He actually refers to you as one of the graduates of that. And so in thinking about symbolic systems, not just as a major, but as a way of helping foster this convergence in sort of a curricular sense, what would you think from when you did that program, what was it that you think helped you in launching your career and then your career beyond, first getting out of Stanford?
Well, I think that one of the things I made a decision that I didn't want to go that deep, but I know that sounds funny. As an undergrad, I figured I would specialize in graduate school, like go on and do a master's or a PhD and like go deeper there. And so I definitely wanted that breadth. I wanted to be able to go broad and not specialize that much. But I will, referring to Professor Wasow, and I've told this story before, I knew I'd taken computer science the previous year to fill a requirement, and I obviously felt like I knew a lot about philosophy and psychology, but I didn't know much about linguistics. And so I discovered symbolic systems when I was on the plane back from my sophomore year of school, and I saw it in the catalog, and I thought it sounded really interesting. I liked a lot of it. But I didn't know much about linguistics at all, but the head of the department was teaching Introduction to Syntax that fall. So I went in, I met with Professor Wasow, and I knew he would try and sell me on the program. Like, he's the head of the program. He's obviously going to try and sell me on the program and on this class. And I said, I read about symbolic systems over the summer. I'm thinking about becoming a symbolic systems major. Do you have any, I'm going to take your introduction to syntax this fall. Like, do you have any advice for me? And he was like, you should absolutely be a symbolic systems major. All the most interesting Stanford students are. Which is like this kind of like testimony, like almost like if you weren't symbolic systems, you weren't interesting, or like you weren't as interesting as you could be. But I will say, there was a lot of amazing things about the program, and I do think another class I always think about is in Intro to Syntax, you go through both the descriptive and the prescriptive version of the English language and how different they actually are, how you're supposed to talk versus how people actually do. And I think about that a lot too, in terms of how do we prescribe technology versus how it actually gets used. But I think that there's a lot of wonderful things about the program, but one of the most wonderful things about the program was that there was this wonderfully diverse group of students, and even the people who were in my honors thesis, some people were doing one of them had dancing musical digital puppets, another one was trying to do stereo vision with $100 cameras. They were doing I was doing a natural language assistant for travel planning. We were all doing radically different things. But it was really interesting to try and see the connections between them and be in a room with people who were doing such interesting projects and interesting work, even if it was really disjoint from your own.
And then it seems like there's collaborative projects here, but then those skills also translate into careers afterward. And that's one of the things you talk a lot about in the book, Scott, is that you show lots of examples of people who sort of had this background where they were able to bring together the fuzzy side of things with then solving problems that involved, technical expertise as well and bringing that together. So what are some of the examples that you would want to share of some of the, stronger collaborations and how you think they were made to work?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways we have this misnomer of thinking of technology companies as tech monoliths, because even the core insights that have led to the virality of Facebook explosive growth was basically a psychological insight of photo tagging and drawing people in through that hook. Or Snapchat in many ways, I think had a sociological insight about photographs as a means of communication, as picture is 1,000 words. And so it's interesting to look at these tech companies through the lens of how they're also sociology companies, how they're also psychology companies, and there's really a place for all of us in these places to play a role. In the book, I highlight, because my role previously has been as a venture capitalist, so I've dealt a lot with technology founders, and the observation that I had in the VC seat was that so many of the really interesting companies that I was meeting with, they were founded by people from all these different walks of life. And I said, what is it about the Symbolic Systems major in particular? There were these amazing people founding great companies like Mike Krieger at Instagram, or Chris Cox, who is the chief product officer at Facebook. And I said, they really have this insight to kind of straddle both worlds, like you mentioned, sort of logic, psychology, philosophy, and computer science. They're technical enough to be dangerous and to speak the speak, talk the talk, and hire the team. But then they maybe also took a theater arts class where they've got this incredible theatrical bit to them where they can sell a product and communicate a vision. And I found that some of the really fascinating companies were the ones that straddled these two sides. So one in particular is Stitch Fix. It's one that I talk about a bit in the book. So Katrina Lake, she was Stanford class of '05, and she was political science economics major. And she went to consulting after school. She worked in retail consulting, really got to understand a fundamental problem. And she said, I'm doing all this consulting work, I have no free time. I go home and I have Netflix, which seems to understand what my preferences are, and it can serve me movies really effectively. What if I had Netflix for my closet? I have no time to go shopping, but what if I could build Netflix for my closet? And so it was really this insight of understanding the problem and then understanding that it was going to have a heavy logistics element and a heavy machine learning element. And she was able to go find those perfect people and then convince them, sell them her vision. And obviously, fast forwarding 5 years, she's been able to create a $1 billion company that's public with 4,000 employees that really sort of blends, I think, this approach to taking machine learning, a very technical subject, applying it to retail, which is something that she learned, but then hiring a whole team of 4,000 fuzzies that are basically human-to-human interface designers that are communicating the product on the front lines, and 80 data scientists kind of behind the scenes that are making the pipes to kind of create the queues of items that go to those 4,000 stylists that then get passed on to clients. So I think Stitch Fix is an interesting example to me of a fuzzy techie company. But again, I think when we look kind of beneath the hood of a lot of tech companies, they're fundamentally also psychology companies, also sociology companies, and it's sort of the vector through which we look at those companies that makes it interesting.
Interesting, because one of the things that you alluded to that Marissa had also mentioned before was this notion of empathy, right? And this notion of being able to empathize with the user to understand what they want and see what the problems are. There's also the notion of empathy of thinking about what kind of culture are you fostering in your company. And since you mentioned VCs, it's kind of taken me in a little bit of a turn because recently there have been some VCs that have kind of been on the hot seat for not such a great environment that they've created. And I think in that regard, Tracey, you've been involved with Project Include to actually help promote more diversity in the workplace. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what were the motivations for doing it and what the goals are.
So Project Include is a nonprofit I co-founded a couple of years ago with 7 other women in tech around the idea of increasing diversity and inclusion in tech startups. And what we are seeing is in the last few years, there's been increasingly discussion of the lack of diversity and all the implications that has for the tech industry and for the world. If you look at the products that are getting built, it's easiest to solve the problems that you yourself have, and that the only people that are working in tech come from a very singular demographic, a lot of times relatively young, white and Asian men in urban areas with disposable income. The sorts of products that get built are the ones that serve those people. And in addition to that, on the VC side, a lot of interesting ideas not getting funded. We're seeing increasing discussion about that lack of diversity and inclusion. Some of it's just very obvious if you look at the rooms and if you look at the numbers, that wasn't there. But more people were starting to get interested in solving this problem and didn't know what to do. We felt like it would be useful to put together a basic handbook of these resources so startups would have somewhere to go. And we also thought that tech startups were a really good place to be focused because there's more leverage there. It's much harder to shift a company of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees towards a more inclusive culture than it is to get someone on the right path from early on. And so Project Include launches just a set of recommendations, everything from defining culture and implementing culture to manager training, resolving conflicts. And there's a section on there for VCs that want to be more diverse and inclusive in their own partnerships as well as in their investments. So we wanted to put out these resources to try to guide the industry towards these solutions.
That makes sense. And it seems to sort of follow with, there's a large body of research that says if you have more diverse teams, you sort of get richer solutions or a solution space that addresses more people.
Yeah. Specifically in the space of innovation, when you want to come up with creative solutions to things, when you have more diverse teams, you will have better outcomes. And this has been validated through decades of research. They've been able to look at correlational data, like public companies, but also in kind of like the research setting, forcing teams to be diverse has caused them to have more creative outcomes. And I think intuitively that makes sense where when you are confronted with a room full of people that are different than yourself, you no longer assume that you are operating under the same assumptions. You work a little bit harder to justify your opinions. And this is true not just of demographic diversity, but they've seen it with rooms full of Republicans and Democrats. And just like knowing that people around you are different forces people to be more creative.
So in thinking about that, bring those folks together. All of you have had lots of experience in various parts of industry. And so I think for some students who are here, they sort of see this straight line from majoring in computer science or an engineering field into going to a specific job in high tech. And so sometimes the culture on campus may not make it as clear for someone studying the humanities or more of a fuzzy what those kind of opportunities are. And clearly you've worked with people with diverse backgrounds. So kind of generally, what are the examples you've seen of folks who came from these fuzzy backgrounds? And you've already mentioned a few of them, but if there's more that you want to highlight, who you thought made important contributions at the places you were at.
There's one great example of, I think we were talking earlier about how we tend to lionize the end product and we say, gosh, they had this crazy vision to see all the way to the end state at the beginning. We forget that everyone sort of launches and iterates their way to success. And so Slack, for example, Stuart Butterfield has not just 1 degree in philosophy, but 2 degrees in philosophy. And he's been public about talking about the value that he thinks, obviously, serial tech entrepreneur, founded Flickr, went to Yahoo, right? And then Slack, which was originally TinySpec, which is a gaming company that sort of had a sidecar product that was for communications within the engineering team, that they said, well, this gaming company is not really going anywhere. Why don't we invest more time and resources in this communications product? And that sort of segues over to Slack. And so I think he credits, to some degree, obviously being technical enough to be dangerous, not intimidated by technology, sort of getting in and rolling up his sleeves, but this ability through philosophy to deal with ambiguity and gray area questions and sort of follow an argument, interrogate an argument all the way down, which in many ways I think is the job of a good product manager, a good leader, to sort of tease out what may be the right answer, but you're not confident with 100% certainty. You've got to wade into that water with some level of ambiguity and be comfortable in that zone, and then be able to communicate those ideas clearly and effectively. And so those are two qualities from a philosophy background that Stuart Butterfield credits as being part of his success is, one, being able to write clearly and effectively, and two, being able to follow an argument all the way down to its point of logical conclusion, but it's still not perfect, and being comfortable with that.
Well, I think for most majors, there's kind of a natural, there's a natural place you might end up, and I've seen strong examples across all kinds of companies, everywhere from a lot of people who are strong in writing will end up in, marketing or PR because they can communicate really clearly. Economics, ultimately does really well in the finance departments. There's tons of opportunities as these companies. When you actually look at them at the end of the day, a lot of times it's 10% or 20% of the workforce that's technical, and it's actually the vast majority that are really making all the different elements of the company work overall. And so I think that's a really important element of it. Visual design, and actually one of the best usability analysts I've ever worked for, I worked with her both at Google and at Yahoo, was a PhD in psychology. So she was amazing at going in and doing user studies, analyzing log data, understanding what was happening with the users, what was a biased experiment, what was an unbiased experiment, right? Why things might be happening the way they were happening on the site. But she just did an amazing job. But she was very firm. I remember in the first interview, she's like, I don't design, I don't write code, I'll never do a mock-up for you, but I can tell you what's going on with your users, and I can tell you in a perfect, clinical, psychological way how to test for it and understand it. So.
One of the things that I read that Eric Schmidt commented on for success at Google was not related to major, but it was related to two characteristics, one being persistence and the other being curiosity. And I really like that because I think it cuts across all disciplines. Recently I was talking at a large investment bank in Boston, and they said, as we look around the table of leadership at our company, we singularly hire who comes in our door, and they seem to be finance majors, accounting majors, people that studied, to Mehran's point, sort of the A to A relationship. They have a degree title, and they see a job title, and they say, that matches what I have, I'm gonna apply there. And yet the senior leadership at this bank was predominantly people who had studied English and philosophy and history, and they said, what's going wrong or what's happening in our organization where none of these people are rising to be around this table? What is it that, do we need to hire more of us, or do we need to foster have more mentorship programs to keep people engaged? And they sort of arrived at the same conclusions as Eric Schmidt, that there was something that led to a 20 or 30 year career at this bank, where it was fundamentally based on the curiosity and sort of this continual reinvestment in the learning process, to have the curiosity to see, what is it about retirement savings or the market dynamics today, and they were continually engaged in the idea of markets, not just the sort of day-to-day mechanics of the business. And so I think that those are all sort of skills that are readily applicable across a lot of different industries that we think about.
And there certainly are common misconceptions. I think Eric Roberts always talked about the fact that there was a grid study that he described that talked about the fact that programming ability was actually more highly correlated to verbal SAT scores than math SAT scores. That basically once you sort of got into the 700s in math, most of those people had good enough math skills to be good programmers, and what actually divided sort of the 95th versus 99th percentile programmers was actually their verbal SAT. It was much more highly correlated because they were able to break down problems more, communicate more. And when they wrote code in teams, other people could understand how they were approaching it and how they had laid out the algorithm better.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those things that gets overlooked more in the academic setting, but when you go into the industrial setting of the importance of communication, working in teams, people being able to get along. So to get into the little bit of the nuts and bolts of the industrial setting, and a quote a figure that's a little bit shocking, let's delve into that. So according to the Stanford Computer Forum, the average starting salary for Stanford CS undergrads in 2016 was $110,000. So there's lots of techie careers that are sort of seen as lucrative, and sometimes they're seen as an inequality then as a result of fuzzy careers. So what do you think of in terms of when you think of, one, from the nuts and bolts side, the earning potential in terms of fuzzy majors, but secondly, and probably more importantly, how do we address that inequality if there is an inequality in the long term? Not the softball question, by the way.
What's one framework which I think is interesting is, we all sort of think about our education and platform as it's a consumption product. It's what do you love to study? What do you love to do? It's an investment, obviously. It's a lot of money. And then to some degree, we think about it as an insurance product. Like, am I going to be relevant in 10 years or 20 years? How should we be thinking? We read all these articles about automation and AI, and is there even going to be a role for me? And one of the most interesting, I think, counterintuitive points that I like to sort of point out is that, as machine learning and as automation sort of takes over some of the rote aspects, the scripted aspects, the things that we've done over and over again, what actually rises to the surface are a lot of these human skills, a lot of these soft skills of empathy, as Marissa mentioned, of communication, collaboration, things that we haven't seen before, so being able to improvise and be flexible. But to the nuts and bolts, the $110,000 is certainly more than I made when I came out as a political science major. But then, as you sort of follow through your career, you realize that the skills that you've built, there's a great quote by a behavioral psychologist, B.F. Skinner, from the 50s, where he says, education is everything that you have left over when what you've learned fades away. And I think it's really an interesting idea because we all have taken a million classes, yet you can count on two hands probably what you remember about a specific class a decade, 2 decades ago. But it's that core curiosity, the persistence, the grit, some of those aspects that, those are the things, those are the elements of education that stay with you, right?
It's very anecdotal, but it's humorous, and he had probably one of the best career moves I've ever seen. But one of my early colleagues at Google, he actually joined before me, he was one of the people who recruited me there, was a guy named Salar Kamangar. And basically, he graduated from Stanford with a degree in biology. And he'd been using Google and loved it. And so he, biked over to Palo Alto, rang the buzzer at Google, managed to get himself upstairs and talk to Larry and Sergey. And he was like, I just love this website. I use it all the time. I just think it's totally amazing. I just want to work here. And Larry and Sergey were like, that's awesome. We would love to have you work here. But, you can't code, so we can't pay you. And so Salar was like, that's okay. I'll work for free, and I'll just show you how valuable I am. So literally, he just started showing up to work, unpaid for the whole summer. And in the end, he became Google employee number 9. Now he heads up some of Google's really important venture efforts. He headed up YouTube for a lot of years. He's compensated every bit as well as the early engineers were in the end. But he knew that he had the persistence, he had the curiosity, and he had skills that he knew would ultimately prove really useful. And he saw an idea that he was really passionate about. He knew that he was passionate about the Google technology, and was like, I'm gonna actually bet on myself that I can make a big impact here and contribution that will be recognized, even if they're not recognizing me today.
It's actually funny, that person at Facebook, I think she's still there, but Naomi, she was my class at Stanford 2005, and she did the same thing. She biked down to Palo Alto. She showed up at Facebook. She said, I really like this blue and white website that you've got going on here. I wrote my science, technology, and society senior thesis on social networks. I'd love to work for you. I can't code, but as of today, I believe she's the #1 oldest tenured employee after Mark Zuckerberg, because everyone else in between has left to go and founded Quora and other platforms. But
I do think it is undeniable that there's a huge gap in compensation, and if you study computer science or some technical field, it's a lot easier to get a job because there is a straight line between the degree and roles that need to be filled. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projects a shortfall of like 1 million jobs in computing that will be unfilled by 2020 because there's just not enough people who are studying the technical fields. So when you look at the supply and demand mismatch, if you study something technical and can do the technical work, you'll get compensated really well. And these differentials are very real. When I joined Pinterest, for example, there was another woman who joined the same time as me, same year graduating from university, but she was non-technical. She got 1/10 the equity that I got in Pinterest because I was an engineer and we needed engineers to build the platform, and the core value prop was technical, and she was working in HR and she was making the office run, but there are many people who could do that job. So when you look at supply and demand, like that's just what the market netted out at. And that's still the case when you look at the difference between the technical and non-technical roles. So I think it is really great to celebrate the people who made their ways in and found ways to be really helpful and useful and became leaders in these tech companies without technical backgrounds. But I think the reality is still there is this big supply-demand mismatch. And some of it is that technology companies and technology industry devalues the humanities and devalues things that aren't technical, but there's also the practical realities of building these companies and what roles you need there.
And I do think it's also worthwhile pointing out, well, the income disparity is, that first offer, there is a disparity, you can't deny that. Sometimes those very well-paying jobs are not that interesting. Right, so regardless, you should go for a job that you feel is interesting and inspiring for you. I remember one of the more interesting, I ran this program at Google called the Associate Product Manager Program. It was a 2-year program. We hired in really high potential people who were good at understanding how technology would be applied. And there was a student at MIT, of course, right, boo hiss, right? But MIT, who I really wanted to join the program, but I paid all the associate product managers the same. I think that at that time they all got $80,000, the same amount of stock, and we said, look, based on performance, we'll differentiate you later with refresh grants and bonuses, but up front, everyone gets the same offer. And he was like, well, I have this job offer from Goldman Sachs that's $130,000. And this was probably in the early 2000s, so it was a lot of money. And he was like, I'm graduating from MIT, I just need to be making 6 figures, I can't take a job that's not 6 figures. And I was like, well, my problem is I'm hiring a class of people, they're all coming in together. I don't know who's gonna be better than who, and I'm just not comfortable making an offer where we differentiate. So, if you want to bet on yourself, come in for this offer, you might get disproportionately rewarded. But I was like, but also no offense to Goldman Sachs, because I know there are other jobs, but this particular job, I was like, tell me about this job at Goldman Sachs. And he was told me about it, and I was like, what are you gonna be programming in? His answer was COBOL. And I was who else is on the team? And this was the first new grad that they had hired into that team in 25 or 30 years, right? And so I was at the end of the day, I actually made peace with the fact that he did choose the Goldman Sachs job. But I was look, if writing COBOL, and trying to fix bugs on 30-year-old programs is floats your boat, go for it. I guess, you can go and make a lot of money doing that, but it's probably going to be less inspiring and interesting in the end.
I think another point, just to jump in there too, is when we think about, I know you study literature, you study Russian literature, you don't need to have read and memorized every book of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. You need to sort of know where the big pieces are. And I think similarly, to be technical enough to participate in this world, you need to sort of know where the big pieces are. And the languages are moving so quickly and there's so many new libraries and new frameworks and TensorFlow and something else is coming next week. And so I think there was an article in TechCrunch a while back about becoming a full stack integrator. And I loved that term of sort of knowing the building blocks, and the building blocks are kind of coming in these larger and larger chunks. So I'd say, learn enough that you're to the extent that you're passionate, but then follow your passion, because there's all these different cuts through the material. And certainly unlocking, breaking the ceiling, breaking the ice on being technical certainly is helpful in our kind of technology-led world. So the book that I wrote is very much pro-technology from my perch in Silicon Valley as well. But I think it's unlocking this other side of when we think about machine learning, when we think about big data, we tend to look at this notion that We've got sensors that are becoming cheaper. We've got them baked into our fabric, into our cars, into our walls. And with more and more data, actually going all the way back to Plato, people said with more data, there's more information, there's going to be more knowledge and more wisdom. And actually, maybe that's true on some small level, but really it's about asking the questions. And so getting at these questions from different angles, from different perspectives, from different backgrounds, I think will become more and more important as these chunks get bigger and bigger. And not everyone's going to build the machine learning algorithm. You're going to pull from a library, or you're going to tweak it. Maybe 2 engineers will tweak it, but then a bunch of people will ask questions of it, make sure it's free from bias. Those are different perspectives sort of on learning enough to be dangerous, but then you don't need to know everything about everything.
Well, with respect to learning might be dangerous, and one of the things, Tracey, you said the tech industry devalues humanities. And I just wanted to follow up on that point because I'd add the clause, given recent events, comma, perhaps maybe to its detriment. And one of the articles that we were talking about before this panel was there was an article in the Boston Globe by Jonathan Zunger, who was a colleague at Google for a few of us, talking about the Facebook Cambridge Analytica debacle that happened and the importance of ethical considerations in technology. And so the question I wanted to turn around first to Tracey and then to the rest of the panel is, how do you see that interplay between a humanities education and then going out into the workforce and making sure that what happens even in tech companies is following guidelines that we would think of as ethical or reaching a societal outcome that we would like to have?
I think some of this has to be driven by society at large. And if we just acknowledge that we are operating in a very capitalist society right now and companies optimize around making money, it is very easy to trade off things incorrectly. And so I think some of what we're seeing now around this like Facebook, Cambridge Analytica debacle is that consumers are upset and don't like what's happening, and that's putting some more pressure on Facebook, not just from the consumer side, but also from government and like the hearings that they're having in front of Senate to steer in a better direction. But I think it's very hard to expect that in a world that is so capitalistic that companies will not necessarily just move the most ethical directions.
Yeah, it's interesting with regard to the sort of the nudges that happen. So we talk a lot about the attention economy and focus on the advertising as a business model, and optimizing sort of technology is not agnostic on its own. We're A/B testing to optimize for certain outcomes, and those outcomes can be maximizing ad revenue, but they can also be, on the flip side, these different types of nudges or technological paternalism. You're basically outsourcing your values for somebody else to decide. But those decisions, I think the really difficult thing is some of them may be good. For example, Omada Health is a company in San Francisco that uses a lot of behavioral interventions to nudge people to be more active in their lifestyles, to get them off the couch, because if they lose weight, lose body mass index, they have a lower chance of getting diabetes. And so then the question is, well, if that's the outcome that we're A/B testing and heavily optimizing for versus an ad click, is that then fine, but the ad click is not fine? And so who's sort of making these values determinations? And these are just big philosophical questions. There's no right or wrong answer necessarily, but I think these are the type of issues that society seems to be now grappling with. And I think the realization that these are not just purely technology issues, they're also a whole bag of worms.
I personally am just not sure there's as much of a connection there. I think that there were obviously some problems that were made, and I wish I could say, well, if there had been a huge infusion of more fuzzies and more ethics into Facebook, it would have gotten solved. But I actually think that, when you look at it, it's basically that these products are really deep. They're very sophisticated and complicated. And when there's very, very smart people working at Facebook, and they sat there, looked at it, brainstormed how it could be used, the applications that could be built, and it seemed like they would probably build pretty interesting things with it. 2 years later, that API, they decided, okay, it didn't actually, really come to fruition the way that we thought, and they had someone abuse their terms of service. And I'm not sure that there's a lot that could happen that could help that, other than people getting a lot more versed in the sort of the discipline of it. It's interesting, I talked with Reid Hoffman, who's also coincidentally a symbolic systems major at LinkedIn. For whatever reason, LinkedIn didn't follow that suit and roll out a similar API. But I wish I could say it's because of his broad background in education. I don't think it was. I think it was just that, once you've worked in social networking for a long time and thought about what that data is, the value it has, how it could be used, how it could be misused, you get a better feel for it. But right now, we're kind of in the first frontier, in the first inning, so to speak, and people are just sometimes not that aware of the way it could be abused or misused later on. And it's even when you've got people who are, the people at Facebook and the people at LinkedIn are as skilled at this as anyone could be. And it's even Reid will say, it wasn't, he's like, when that API came out, he was like, interesting, I don't think we should do it, but he couldn't even really articulate why, right? And so when you've got people skilled in the art and they can't really agree on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea or even foresee some of the abuses, it's really just an issue that, we're just too new in that discipline or too new in that field to really see the problems.
So I think there are those cases where it's hard to anticipate how a product might get used or what impacts that might have. I think there's also the question of once you do see something heading in the wrong direction, are you able to pull that back and address it? And there are examples of companies that have behaved very unethically, and people who should have known that what they were building or working on was unethical and not stopping it. So I think there are many examples coming out of Uber. These sorts of tools that they're building to track people or evade law enforcement. It seems like the people who are working on those should have said no. I think Zenefits also built some software to evade or to bypass certification processes in different states. And it seems like there's a void of morality that seems to be happening in some of these tech workplaces as they're building products. So there are the cases where it's just impossible to know that Facebook's engagement algorithms would cause the sort of clickbait and these holes that people would go down that then tip the election, possibly. But there are also cases that are pretty clear, and if they had seen things trending in that direction, why didn't people pull back then?
Yeah, and as these technologies obviously go off the screen, into the car, off the screen, into many different folds of our lives, from Amazon Alexa in your house, where if something happens, can those records be subpoenaed by a court? There are all these big kind of questions about justice, about we sort of point the finger at social media today, but we forget that in 2010 it was the rise of the Arab Spring and sort of democracy promotion, and in 2008 it was the platform that gave Barack Obama a chance at the presidency. So it was very easy to kind of flip the tables and sort of impugn the motives, but again, they're very smart people asking big questions, and it's certainly not based on what they majored in, that is why they succeeded or not. But the focus, I think, on these issues from a macro level is interesting because it's bringing the sort of liberal arts ideas out into the public forum, where at least we're grappling with these really tough questions in public, and that's a healthy debate. There may not be a right or wrong answer, but the fact that we're debating these things in public is just like having a huge, political science class, a huge philosophy class that's on the front pages.
One thing I really liked in the article you referenced by Jonathan Zunger is he talked about how in some other domains, scientists have had to think about the ethics of what they're working on. So if you look at chemistry or physics, where some of the work that they had done was turned into weapons, like chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, and the scientists doing this research had to ask themselves if this was the right thing to be working on. You could talk about advancing things in the name of science, but knowing that what they were working on could be turned into weapons of destruction or death, they had to think about those consequences. And we're just starting to see much more of that in software engineering in the tech industry, where it is possible to build these recommendation systems, but knowing that they could be used in particular ways, it may be instructive for us to now ask the questions of how will this be used and how should that inform what I actually work on?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. There's actually a great documentary, not just good, but great documentary, I'll put a plug in, called The Day After Trinity by director John Elsa, and chronicles the Manhattan Project. And actually many of the physicists involved with the Manhattan Project went on to become peace activists after the project was over. So you're all alumni of Stanford. What's the one thing here that you would want to share with folks in the room that was, either curricular or extracurricular or whatever, that impacted you in an unexpected and a positive way? There were none. No, I'm sure.
I think one thing for me is that I had one close friend of mine who we were standing in front of a map in his room, and he said the counterintuitive point, which was that life is long. We're going to get to all these places. And it was the opposite of what normally you hear if people stand in front of a map and say, life's short, where do you want to go? And I loved that perspective. And I think taking a long view on your friendships, on the people that you meet, on your education, on your professors, and really get to know a whole set of people. Because I think for me, I've got sort of unpredictable friendships with people from many different parts of one particular class, like Tristan Harris you mentioned. We actually met in an Egyptian history class, of all places, and he's still a close friend. So had I not taken that class, I would never have met Tristan. So there's interesting kind of cuts through the university. I'd say take the long view.
I had one very interesting experience in computer science. So I started off thinking I was maybe going to major in computer science, took a couple of courses, and then decided to not major in it because I was so intimidated by my classmates and felt like I was never going to catch up. I took CS 106B and 107, and after that I'm done with CS. The next quarter after that, the lecturer who had taught CS 107, Jerry Kane, reached out to me and asked me to TA for him. And my immediate response to him was, you must be confusing me for somebody else because I didn't do very well in your class. I have a generic Asian sounding name, so maybe you mixed me up with another Asian, and like lots of CH names. So we went back and forth probably 3 times, me saying, I don't think you actually want to invite me to TA because I don't know this material, and him saying, I know who you are, you've been to my office hours, like I want you to TA. And he ultimately took responsibility. He was like, if you're a bad TA, it's on me because I am the person teaching this class. So you should just do it. And I did TA for 107 2 quarters after I took it. And the change in perspective was completely mind-boggling. So as a student, I had thought that I was doing very poorly in the class. And I heard all my classmates, mostly male, talking about how easy it was. And this was supposed to be a weeder class, but it was really not that hard. And me feeling like I was just incompetent. And when they talked about how long it took them to do the assignments, they're like, oh, it took me 3 hours to do that Kevin Bacon assignment. And I was thinking it took me 15. So I was quantifiably 5 times worse than them. And I realized when I was TAing and I had to grade their assignments that people's calibration of their own performance to their actual performance was not very good. And there was definitely a lot of people who thought that they were amazing, that they're fine. And having that different perspective, like knowing like I'd done all these assignments myself 2 quarters prior and seeing the code quality of the students I was grading and being able to actually see how I would have put myself if I had to rank. It was just a really useful perspective. Switching from being student to teaching assistant taught me a lot about how the world functions, and also there's like some gendered differences at play here. But that perspective shift was really valuable, and it's also been something that's been really useful in the workplace and understanding how differently people can perceive the same situation, how they self-describe can be very different from the reality on the ground.
Well, I didn't know that Tracey was also Jerry Kane's TA, as was I. So maybe the pro tip is be Jerry Kane's TA. But trying back to the panel, what I would say is, don't bow to people's expectations. I think that when you look at fuzzy and techie, you might be like, if I am a fuzzy or if I am a techie, people expect this. And when I think about some of the best decisions I made when I was at Stanford, a lot of it was not because it wasn't that expected. Like I knew I was a lot stronger in science and math, yet coming in as a freshman, I took structured liberal education, which I figured like I wouldn't be that good at, but I knew that it would really push me. I also was certain that I was going to become a doctor, and it wasn't until the conversation with Professor Wasow and others that I said, wait, like I think I'm going to go do this totally other thing. And so I always kind of keep questioning, like, wait, are your expectations for yourself and other people's expectations of you that relevant or that right on? And I took my first CS class was actually CS 105A. I don't even know if it still exists. It's computer science for non-majors. That was actually the title of it. And I took it freshman year, spring, just to fill a requirement. And Professor Clausing opened the class the first day and said, so to be clear, we've taught this class for 10 years. We've done studies on everyone. It's like a 400-person class. It's like we've done studies on everyone, and we know statistically that exactly 2 of you will go on to take any other computer science class ever. So like, we're gonna keep this easy, we're gonna keep this simple, right? Like, because I know that you're just trying to fill your requirement and like get on with things. And like, that was literally my first CS class. And if I had just done what Professor Clausing set as the expectation, like, my whole life would not have unfolded the way that it ultimately has. And so I think that notion of questioning even the expectations you're hearing from authority figures and that sort of divide is a good thing to constantly be questioning, is like, wait, are those expectations of what a fuzzy is, a techie is, what I should be doing right now, really that relevant?
Wonderful. Well, let's take a moment to thank our panelists. Thanks very much. And thanks also to Lewis Newman and Niles Wilson and the UAR program for putting this event together. Thanks very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.